Welcome to the first lesson of our course, The Age of Nation-States in Europe. Together, we'll dive into European history, exploring the transformative period from the French Revolution in 1789 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. But let me ask you, why should we concern ourselves with the rise of nation-states in the 19th century? What makes this era so pivotal, not only for Europe but for the world? During this century, the nation-state gradually replaced the territorial state across much of Europe. Nationalism began as a European phenomenon but later spread to the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Yet this process unfolded unevenly. While national states were forming in Europe, regions like the Middle East and Africa only fully experienced the rise of nationalism after World War II. What can these differences tell us about the nature of nationalism itself? The 20th century, of course, brought the fall of multinational empires like the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, particularly in the wake of World War I. Woodrow Wilson's vision of self-determination promised new national states for minorities, but did it really deliver? On the Balkan Peninsula, Yugoslavia was born, a state uniting South Slavs, while Czechoslovakia emerged from Slovak and Czech territories. And yet, these creations often sowed seeds of tension rather than harmony. Moving to the Cold War, we see nationalism suppressed in Eastern Europe by communist regimes. But as the 1980s came to a close, nationalist movements re-emerged with force. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall unleashed demands for independence, leading to events like the peaceful split of Czechoslovakia and the violent fragmentation of Yugoslavia. What fueled these contrasting paths, and why does nationalism remain such a powerful force? Meanwhile, Western Europe embarked on a different journey. With the formation of the European Economic Community in 1973, later the European Union, leaders aimed to transcend nationalism and build a supranational political structure. But not everyone agreed. Some countries let their citizens vote on EU integration, reigniting nationalist debates. Can a unified Europe truly coexist with deeply rooted national identities? Or are we witnessing a resurgence of nationalism even in this age of globalization? In recent decades, movements like those in Kosovo remind us of nationalism's enduring appeal and its potential for both unity and division. While this course won't tackle the complexities of 20th and 21st century nationalism directly, understanding the roots of the nation-state in the 19th century provides critical insight into these modern dilemmas. In this lecture, we'll set the stage by giving an overview of the age of nation-states in Europe, and we start with Absolutism and the Enlightenment. But here's a question to get us started. How did the ideals of the Enlightenment, ideas of reason, liberty, and progress, turn into a direct challenge to the once untouchable absolute monarchies? The clash was especially explosive in France, where the monarchy, epitomized by Louis XIV, the Sun King, had long symbolized absolute power. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideas and a storm of political and economic tensions collided, triggering the French Revolution in 1789. What made France the epicenter of this upheaval? From the storming of the Bastille to the brutal reign of terror under Robespierre, we'll follow the revolution's dramatic and often violent turns. When Robespierre fell, the stage was set for the rise of the Directory, a government that ruled for 5 tumultuous years before being overthrown by an ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. How did this one man transform himself from revolutionary hero to Emperor of France in just a few years? Napoleon didn't just reshape France. He shook all of Europe. Monarchs from Austria's Habsburgs to Prussia's Hohenzollerns and Russia's Romanovs saw him as an existential threat, not only to the balance of power, but to monarchy itself. Yet Napoleon's military genius kept him undefeated for years. So, what led to his downfall? The turning point came with his ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812. Imagine this: the largest invasion force in history at the time, 600,000 men, marching into the vast Russian winter. What could go wrong? As it turned out, everything. The retreat from Russia decimated his army, leaving him vulnerable to a coalition of European powers. By 1814, he was forced into exile on Elba. But Napoleon wasn't finished yet. Why did he return, and what drove his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815? With Napoleon exiled to St. Helena, the old monarchies sought to reassert control. Enter the Congress of Vienna, led by Prince von Metternich. Its mission? To restore Europe's political and diplomatic balance, crush the revolutionary and nationalist ideals unleashed by the French Revolution, and return to the old order. But could this conservative vision really hold back the tides of change? Spoiler, it couldn't. The revolutionary and nationalist movements only grew stronger, culminating in the widespread upheavals of 1848. What made these ideas so unstoppable, even under fierce repression? Meanwhile, another revolution was quietly transforming Europe, the Industrial Revolution. Starting in Britain around 1750, it fundamentally reshaped society, economy, and daily life. Why was Britain the birthplace of industrialization? Innovations like the spinning jenny and the steam engine revolutionized production, leading to the rise of factory systems. By the mid-19th century, Britain had evolved from an agrarian society into a powerhouse of industrial capitalism, and other European nations soon followed. The rise of capitalism, the revolutions of 1848, and the birth of modern Europe. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a time of invention and innovation. It was a seismic shift that reshaped the way societies functioned. One of its most profound outcomes was the rise of capitalism, a system designed to harness the power of free markets. But what did this mean for the people swept up in this economic transformation? How did this new economic order set the stage for revolutionary upheaval? The year 1848 was a turning point in European history, a year when revolutions swept across the continent like wildfire. This was no isolated event. It was the first truly pan-European revolution in modern history. It all began in France, where revolutionaries abolished the monarchy and reinstated the republic. But the flames of rebellion didn't stop there. They leaped across the Rhine into the German states, igniting uprisings of a different nature. In France, the revolutionaries were driven by a liberal agenda. They sought a constitutional government, the abolition of the monarchy, expanded voting rights, and a more representative political system. But Central Europe? That was a much thornier issue. Nationalism complicated everything. How could you build liberal governments while simultaneously grappling with the desire for national unity? In the German states, revolutionaries didn't just want to topple their rulers. They wanted to create a unified Germany, a single nation for all Germans. This nationalist aspiration threatened the very fabric of Europe's multinational empires, particularly the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. In 1848, the Habsburgs faced revolts in Bohemia, Hungary, and their Italian provinces. Cities like Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Frankfurt, Berlin, and even Rome became hotbeds of revolutionary fervor. Could the old empires withstand this dual challenge of liberalism and nationalism? By the end of 1848, the revolutions had been largely suppressed. Monarchies reclaimed their thrones, and conservatism seemed to triumph. But the story didn't end there. The conservatives weren't content to simply hold on to power. They adapted. They began to wield nationalism as a tool, transforming it from a revolutionary force into an instrument of state building. Over the next half-century, nationalism became the foundation of modern conservatism. It was no longer about rebellion, but about loyalty to a unified state. Two of the most dramatic examples of this were the unifications of Italy and Germany. At the mid-19th century, Italy was a fragmented patchwork of states, with the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont as its most prominent power. In 1859, Sardinia, led by the astute statesman Camillo Cavour, joined forces with Napoleon III of France to wage war against Austria. After a swift campaign, Austria retained only Venice, and Sardinia began absorbing other Italian states. But there was a price. To secure French support, Sardinia had to cede Savoy and Nice to France. Cavour, however, achieved his ultimate goal, the unification of Italy. Although he died in 1861, his vision endured. Italy's unification wasn't fully realized until 1871, when Rome was finally incorporated. Meanwhile, in Germany, the path to unification was driven by one man's ambition and cunning, Otto von Bismarck. Appointed minister-president of Prussia in 1862, Bismarck pursued his goal with a mix of pragmatism, diplomacy, and war. First, he turned to Denmark in 1864, engaging in a brief war that brought Schleswig and Holstein under Prussian influence. Then, in 1866, he orchestrated a decisive victory over Austria in a lightning campaign. This ended the centuries-long rivalry between the Hohenzollerns of Prussia and the Habsburgs of Austria, firmly establishing Prussia as the dominant German power. Austria, weakened by internal strife and the 1848 revolutions, shifted its focus to southeastern Europe. In 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was born, a fragile dual monarchy splitting the empire between its Austrian and Hungarian halves. With Austria out of the picture, Bismarck turned his attention to France. Napoleon III, already weakened domestically, made the fateful decision to declare war on Prussia in 1870. It was a disastrous miscalculation. Prussia's victory was swift and decisive. In 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed, with King Wilhelm I of Prussia crowned emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a symbolic act of triumph over France. This moment marked the culmination of German nationalism and the birth of what some call the Second Reich, the first being the Holy Roman Empire. While many German liberals were thrilled to see a unified nation, the empire was firmly under Prussian dominance. By the early 1870s, Europe had been profoundly reshaped. Italy and Germany stood as unified nation-states, while Austria and France grappled with the consequences of their losses. Nationalism, once a revolutionary force, had been co-opted by conservative powers to build strong, centralized states. But was this new Europe truly stable? Or had the seeds of future conflicts already been sown? Industrialization, imperialism, and the relentless march of nationalism would soon test the fragile balance of power, leading to even greater upheavals in the years to come. 1871 wasn't just the year of European unifications. It also marked the beginning of what historians call the new imperialism. What set this wave of expansion apart from earlier colonial efforts? Why did European powers suddenly race to carve up distant lands, particularly in Africa and Asia? And what were the consequences of this scramble for dominance? In the late 19th century, especially the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, European powers embarked on a fresh campaign of imperial conquest. This wasn't simply a continuation of earlier colonial adventures. It was a more aggressive, systematic exploitation of the so-called open spaces of the world. Africa, in particular, became the focal point of intense rivalry. The competition was so fierce that Otto von Bismarck, the German Iron Chancellor, stepped in to organize the 1885 Berlin Conference. Here, the great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy, sat down to agree on rules for Africa's division. One key principle: the nation controlling a coastline gained rights to its hinterland, provided they maintained a military and administrative presence. This policy tied colonies more closely to European economies, sparking unprecedented exploitation. Imperialism took on a chilling new form in the colonies, driven by private enterprises that often ruled with brutal efficiency. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Congo Free State, the personal domain of Belgium's King Leopold II. What kind of monarch treats an entire region as his private property? The exploitation here was unparalleled, marked by the systematic abuse of the local population for economic gain. While European powers expanded their empires abroad, seismic shifts were happening at home. Socialism emerged as a powerful ideological force, challenging the dominance of liberalism and conservatism. Though the seeds of socialism had been planted earlier in the century, Karl Marx's theories in the mid-1800s gave the movement intellectual rigor and revolutionary potential. Why did socialism gain such traction? The answer lies in the glaring inequalities of industrial capitalism. While wealth and production soared, distribution was anything but fair. Worker dissatisfaction grew, fueling the rise of radical socialist parties and anarchist movements. For Europe's middle class and ruling elites, these developments weren't just unsettling, they were terrifying. Mass politics also took center stage during this period. Universal male suffrage in many European states and the spread of literacy brought new voices into the political arena. Newspapers and public discourse turned politics into a participatory spectacle, forcing elites to confront the demands of an increasingly empowered populace. Socialist parties and labor unions flourished, many embracing revolutionary Marxism and directly challenging the status quo. Amidst the political and social turbulence, Europe experienced an explosion of cultural and scientific innovation. Think of the transformative ideas of Albert Einstein in physics, Charles Darwin in biology, and Sigmund Freud in psychology. In the arts, Impressionism emerged as a bold new movement, led by figures like Manet, Monet, and Renoir. Meanwhile, Van Gogh and Gauguin laid the groundwork for Expressionism, forever changing the way we view the world. How did these creative and intellectual leaps shape the European psyche? They mirrored the chaos and transformation of a continent grappling with its identity, oscillating between tradition and modernity. Between 1871 and 1890, Europe enjoyed relative stability under the careful stewardship of Otto von Bismarck. Through a complex web of alliances, Bismarck sought to isolate France and maintain peace among Europe's great powers, his primary partners, Austria-Hungary and Russia. But when Kaiser Wilhelm II ascended to power, everything changed. Breaking with Bismarck's cautious diplomacy, Wilhelm pursued an ambitious and aggressive policy known as Weltpolitik. His vision was nothing less than transforming Germany into a global power, a goal that hinged on acquiring colonies in Africa and Asia. The fallout from Bismarck's dismissal was immediate. The European balance of power collapsed, and tensions between Germany and the other major powers, Britain, France, and Russia, escalated dramatically. Was Europe on an inevitable collision course with war? As Europe edged closer to the 20th century, nationalism continued to stir unrest, especially in its two weak empires, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. These sprawling multi-ethnic states faced growing resistance from nationalist movements within their borders. The Balkans, in particular, became a cauldron of ethnic tensions and political instability. The Ottoman Empire, often referred to as the sick man of Europe, struggled to maintain control over its Balkan territories. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary faced its own nationalist crises as ethnic groups sought greater autonomy or outright independence. The stage was set for conflict. By the early 20th century, a series of Balkan crises had sown the seeds of the First World War. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, became the spark that ignited the conflagration. Within weeks, diplomacy failed, Germany invaded Belgium, and Europe was plunged into war. Thus ended the so-called long 19th century, a period that began with the French Revolution and concluded with the outbreak of World War I. It was an age of empires and ideologies, revolutions and reforms, art and science. Yet, as Europe hurtled toward the 20th century, one question loomed large. Could the continent's fragile balance survive the storms of modernity? This is just the opening chapter of the story of nation-states in Europe, a tale that begins with absolutism and the Enlightenment. But as we've seen, the path to the modern era is far from straightforward. What lessons can we draw from the chaos, creativity, and conflict of this transformative age? In our next lesson, we'll dive into the fascinating worlds of absolutism and the Age of Enlightenment. Together, we'll explore how monarchs consolidated their power and ruled with near-total authority, and how the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment began to challenge the foundations of this system, planting the seeds for modern democracy and individual rights. Are you passionate about understanding Europe's journey through the Age of Nation-States and beyond? Subscribe to the Academy of History and Culture to stay updated on more insightful lessons and discussions that bring history to life. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time.